He's been misleading Canadian. The PBO is very clear. More Canadians get money back from the Canada carbon rebate than what they pay. That's very clear. What is also clear is that our plan is working. We've never seen in our history before emissions go down at a time of full economic growth in this country. That has never happened before. We understand we need to do more, and we are doing more to fight climate change. Just yesterday, we announced new measures on taxonomy and disclosure. And next Tuesday, Canadians will receive the next quarterly payment of the Canada carbon rebate, and 8 out of 10 Canadian households where the federal system is applied will receive more money than what they pay. And what Pierre Poilievre is doing is putting tens of billions of dollars of annual investment at risk with his campaign, which is based on a lie. And it's time for him to come clean and apologize to Canadians for having misled them for so long.
Is that the industrial price on pollution is not only less costly, but it also reduces emissions by significantly more than the consumer price. Is there a way, why can't you, get rid of the consumer price and just strengthen the industrial price to make up for those emissions at a much lesser cost?
Our plan has more than 100 measures, and no single measure will enable us to achieve our 2030 targets. We need everything. And the consumer portion of carbon pricing is very important. It's going to provide at least 13 million tons. That's the equivalent of removing from our road 26 million vehicles by 2030. It's an important component. Yes, the industrial system gives us more emission reduction, but we need everything to get...
Less costly, so why not make up those emissions by strengthening the industrial one?
We are doing that. We've strengthened the industrial pricing system a little over a year ago. We're looking at what we could do furthermore going into the future. But if I start removing measures, then you'll be the first one to tell me, well, Minister, you're going further away from your targets. That simply doesn't work. David?
Can I just ask you, the overall conclusion from the PBO, from his briefing, from his report, is that, yeah, we made an error, but largely the conclusion was the same. When you look at the economic costs, when you look at the household costs, you're paying more. So essentially they were right. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that this was not a really big mistake?
That's not what this report says. And the report also says that he acknowledges that he does not take into account the economic benefits that are resulting from carbon pricing in Canada and those benefits to households. That he doesn't take into account the economic impacts to households of climate change and natural catastrophes going up in this country. And hopefully in future reports he will be able to do that. But I think the first paragraph of this report is very clear. More Canadians get more money back than what they pay for carbon pricing.
Mr. Poilievre is also claiming victory today because he's saying he's pulling a different paragraph from the PBO's report, which says that people in the backstop provinces will see a net cost and will pay more in the federal fuel charge and related GST, as well as receiving lower incomes compared to the Canada carbon rebate that they're going to get back. So is there a flaw in this PBO report?
No, you have to look at the entire report. And the entire report says that when you look at direct costs, if you want to look at indirect costs, then you have to look at the cost of climate change. You have to look at the benefits of putting in place carbon pricing and the tens of billions of dollars that are resulting of that. If you want to do indirect, then you have to look at everything. But if you're looking at direct costs, this is what the PBO report says. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I have to go to question.
Are you looking at increasing...
Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing another deep dive today, going to be looking at a recent report all about carbon pricing in Canada.
We'll be breaking down what it means for you. For your wallet, really.
Yeah, we've got this transcript, super interesting, a Canadian political figure responding to a new report on the financial impacts of carbon pricing.
Especially on households. That's what we're zeroing in on.
Right, households like yours, and we've got our expert here, of course, going to help us make sense of it all.
Absolutely, and don't forget the source of all the buzz, the actual report from the PBO. That's the Parliamentary Budget Officer, just in case.
The PBO, right. Okay, so no need for anyone to, dust off those economics textbooks or anything like that. We'll break it all down.
Oh, we'll do the heavy lifting. You just get ready to learn something.
Exactly. Walk away with a clearer picture of what carbon pricing could mean for you. Let's dive right in. This PBO report, the thing that really jumped out at me, the PBO saying households in those provinces that are under that federal carbon pricing system, they're actually going to be getting back more through these climate rebates than they're paying in fuel charges.
By 2030, 2031.
By 2030, 2031.
That's right. And I think it's important, just so we're all on the same page, to remember how this system actually works.
Yeah, I get that.
So the federal government, they put a price on carbon pollution, right, from things like gasoline.
Okay, yeah.
And then a big chunk of that money that's collected goes right back to households through these rebates.
Like a balancing act, kind of?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
But here's where it gets interesting, right? Not all provinces in Canada operate under that federal system.
Right.
Some, what they call backstop provinces, they've got their own system set up.
Exactly. Think of a backstop province as that friend who always brings their own snacks to a party. They're doing their own thing.
I love that analogy.
That's actually perfect. Bring your own snacks provinces. Okay.
Yeah.
So in these bring your own snacks provinces, the PBO's findings get even more, I don't know, nuanced.
Yeah.
And of course, this is where politics loves to jump in.
Right. Definitely. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this transcript. This political figure, they're really hammering home this point about households coming out ahead financially, you know?
Yeah.
They're saying it proves their carbon pricing plan is working.
They're like, see, we told you this would be good for your wallet and the planet.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like their opponent was exactly throwing a victory party, you know?
No.
They're claiming households in those backstop provinces, the ones with their own systems, are actually going to end up paying more because of these federal fuel charges.
Right. They're saying, hold on, it's not all sunshine and roses, basically, especially for those in backstop provinces. And they point to a recent development that definitely, I don't know, threw a wrench into the conversation. The PBO actually admitted to making a mistake in their initial calculations.
Oh, okay, plot twist.
Yeah.
So did they totally mess up, or was it just like a minor slip up?
It wasn't a complete disaster, but it definitely added fuel to the fire. While the PBO admitted to the error, their overall conclusions didn't really change.
Okay.
They're still saying most households will come out on top, you know, but this is where things get a little more complicated.
This feels like one of those situations where everyone's got a calculator, but they're all coming up with different answers, you know?
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of it all?
Right.
What are we missing?
Well, critics are saying that just focusing on those direct costs, like how much you're paying at the pump versus how much you're getting back in these rebates,
Yeah.
that's not the whole picture.
Not the whole picture.
There are all these indirect costs to consider too.
Indirect costs. Okay,
Yeah.
what exactly does that mean in this context? Give us the ELI 5 version.
Sure, think about the costs associated with more extreme weather events,
Okay.
like floods, wildfires.
Yeah.
Those are indirect costs of climate change that can hit households hard.
Yeah.
And they're a lot harder to put an exact number on, you know?
Right, right. It's like you're basically saying there's the price you see on the, like at the pump, and then there's the potential price you pay when your basement floods.
Yeah.
Because of extreme weather. Right. Those hidden costs.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is where the argument gets really tricky, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Do you focus on the immediate, more tangible costs? Or do you factor in these long-term, much harder to predict, but potentially devastating indirect costs?
It's that classic pay now or pay later dilemma, but on a massive scale.
And with so much at stake, you know? Now, this is where the political figure we're following brings in another point.
Yeah.
They argue that their entire carbon pricing plan, which, by the way, involves over 100 different measures,
100.
is working.
Wow.
They point to Canada seeing, for the first time, both emissions going down and the economy growing
Okay.
at the same time.
That's a bold claim. But hold on, over 100 measures? That seems like a lot. Can you give us an example of what some of these other measures might be, besides the carbon pricing on fuel we've been talking about?
Absolutely. One example is what's called the output-based pricing system for these large industrial emitters.
Okay.
Basically, it sets a limit on the amount of greenhouse gases a company can emit.
Okay.
And if they exceed that limit,
Yeah.
they have to pay a price for those excess emissions.
Okay, so it's kind of like a carbon tax, but specifically for these big industries.
Yeah.
And the idea is that it incentivizes them to find ways to pollute less, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you can see how this all starts to fit together, right?
Yeah.
But then they throw in a curveball.
Okay.
This newly announced measure called a carbon pricing taxonomy.
Ooh, a taxonomy. Okay, now you've piqued my interest, I have to admit. What is a taxonomy, and what on earth does it have to do with carbon pricing?
Well, imagine a system that acts like, I don't know, a decoder ring for green investments, in Canada specifically.
A decoder ring. Okay, now you're speaking my language.
Essentially, this taxonomy, it aims to bring clarity to what truly qualifies as a sustainable investment, right?
Okay.
Like setting a gold standard.
So are you saying instead of investors having to decipher all this jargon about eco-friendly this
Yeah.
and sustainable that, the taxonomy will just be like a stamp of approval? Like if it meets the taxonomy's criteria, you know it's legit.
Exactly.
Right.
It's all about transparency and helping to make sure, direct money towards projects that truly align with Canada's climate goals.
Yeah,
And-
makes a lot of sense. So it's like if you're an investor and you're like, I really want to put my money where my mouth is when it comes to fighting climate change,
Mhm.
this taxonomy would basically help ensure that your investment is actually making a difference.
That's the idea, yeah. Now, it's still in the early stages, but there are international examples, that Canada might be looking at for inspiration. Like the European Union, they've got their own taxonomy system.
Interesting. Okay, so Canada's not exactly reinventing the wheel here. They're like taking inspiration from models that are already out there, kind of.
Exactly, and that can be a really smart approach. Like you learn from what's worked elsewhere, and then you adapt it to fit Canada's context.
Okay, that makes sense. Starting to see how this taxonomy could be a really powerful tool. But going back to, like, the political debate for a second, this political figure's opponent, what's their take on all this? Are they on board with the taxonomy idea, or do they have a different perspective?
Well, they haven't specifically addressed the taxonomy yet, but they are raising some interesting questions about, the overall effectiveness of this carbon pricing plan, especially that consumer-focused part we were talking about earlier.
Right, the one where, like, most households are actually getting more back in rebates than they're paying.
Yeah.
What's their issue with that? Seems like a win-win.
Well, they're acknowledging that the rebates do help offset the costs for households, right? But they're arguing that the industry side of this carbon pricing equation has much greater potential when it comes to actually driving down emissions.
So they're saying, why not just go all in on making industries clean up their act, basically, instead of messing around with these rebates for everyday people?
That's one way to put it, yeah. They're suggesting that, focusing more on that industrial side might be a more efficient way to actually achieve these, big emission reduction targets that Canada has set.
Okay, so that makes sense. But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple, right?
Right.
There's got to be a reason why the government's, sticking with this two-pronged approach, targeting both consumers and industry.
You're right. There's always more to the story, right?
Right.
And this is where we go back to that transcript, because this political figure, they actually address this very point.
Okay, I'm all ears. This is where things always get interesting. What's their reasoning for keeping the consumer side of the carbon pricing plan in place?
Well, they argue that if you simply got rid of that consumer-focused portion, even if you really beefed up that industrial side, it would throw Canada off course from hitting those 2030 climate targets.
Interesting. So they're saying both are necessary to achieve those goals, like it's a package deal.
Exactly. They're arguing that every piece of the puzzle is important.
This whole thing reminds me of that game Jenga, where you have to be really strategic about which pieces you remove or the whole tower collapses.
That's a great analogy, and that's what makes this such a complex issue. There's this real balancing act involved.
It's like walking a tightrope. But even with all these different viewpoints and arguments flying around, at least we have that PBO report to, ground us, right? Hard data to cut through the noise.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But remember that calculation error they admitted to?
Yeah.
Well, this is where things get even more interesting.
Hold on. So even with the error, the PBO is saying, look, we messed up the math, but most Canadian households will still be better off.
Yeah, they're sticking to their guns on that.
Trust us, we're the experts, kind of.
Yeah, but not everyone's buying it, and this is where those indirect costs come back in. Remember those?
Extreme weather, the floods, those hidden costs.
Exactly, and the political opponents saying, hey, what about the economic hit from all that?
Because dealing with climate change in now W might seem pricey, but waiting, way worse.
Exactly, an ounce of prevention, right. Yeah. So it all comes down to this balancing act.
Short-term costs versus those big long-term goals.
And trying to see the whole picture, not just the next move, which is why these deep dives are so important, I think.
Totally.
We've got hard numbers from the PBO, but also the politics, the different sides.
And those big questions, the stuff that's harder to measure.
It's complex, but the more we understand, the better, right? It makes us more informed.
Absolutely. So as we come up for air on this carbon pricing deep dive, any final thoughts?
Even when there seem to be clear answers, like with that PBO report, there are always different interpretations, different ways to look at the same data.
Multiple stories being told.
Exactly.
That is something to think about. Well, thank you so much for being our guide today. I always learn so much from you.
Always a pleasure to be here.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on another deep dive. We'll be back soon with another topic that's shaping our world. Until then, keep exploring.